Have you ever wondered what your eyes land on first when you see someone's face?
Hmm.
New research has some genuinely surprising answers, and it might completely change how you think about first impressions.
It really might. Today, we're taking a deep dive into the fascinating science behind, well, what draws our attention when we look at faces and judge attractiveness.
Exactly. And forget those subjective lists of most attractive celebrities. We're going into the data from a new study published in the Laryngoscope.
Yeah, that journal.
Yeah.
It might seem like an odd place, but they do publish on facial perception.
Right. And this study used some seriously cool eye tracking technology to see precisely where people look when forming those, initial opinions.
Uh-huh. The researchers had a very specific goal. Basically, to map out which facial features capture our gaze most strongly when we're evaluating how attractive someone is.
Okay.
And maybe even more interestingly, they wanted to see if these patterns differed between male and female observers.
Okay, let's really unpack why this matters to you, listening right now. Think about those fleeting first encounters, those snap judgments we all make.
We definitely all make them.
Understanding the subconscious visual cues that drive these perceptions can give you a real edge in understanding social dynamics.
Absolutely.
Plus, if you're curious about the world of cosmetic enhancements, knowing what actually grabs attention could be incredibly insightful. We're talking about unlocking some of the hidden rules of attraction here.
Precisely. So our mission in this deep dive is to break down the key findings of this eye tracking study, understand the methodology that let them gather this data,
Right.
and really pull out the most compelling and relevant insights into how we perceive facial attractiveness.
So the big question, where do our eyes naturally gravitate when we look at a face?
Well, it turns out across the board, and this regardless of what people were asked to do in the study,
Uh-huh.
the most time was spent looking at what the researchers called the central triangle of the face.
The central triangle. Okay, what's in
Yeah.
that?
That's the areas that includes the eyes, the nose, and the mouth.
Gotcha.
And what's quite remarkable is that this lines up pretty well with what we already kind of knew about how our brains process faces generally.
Okay, so that part isn't totally unexpected, maybe.
Not entirely. It seems this central area holds a lot of crucial information for recognition and, yeah, perhaps even that initial assessment.
But what happened when people were specifically asked to rate attractiveness? Did their focus shift compared to when they were just, casually looking?
It did indeed, yeah. The group specifically tasked with rating attractiveness showed a notable change in their gaze patterns.
How so?
They spent significantly more time focusing on the mouth, the nose, and even the cheeks.
Oh, interesting. The cheeks, too.
Yes. It seems that when we're actively evaluating attractiveness, our attention is drawn more specifically to these features.
So a more deliberate focus on those areas when we're making a judgment. Makes sense. Now, what about the faces that were deemed more attractive? Where did people tend to look for longer on those faces?
Right, this is where it gets really fascinating. For faces that received higher attractiveness ratings, people spent more overall time looking at that central triangle. Eyes, nose, mouth.
Okay, still the central triangle focus.
Yes, but beyond that, two other features seem to really hold their gaze. The hair,
Hair.
and notably, the mouth again.
Huh. Hair and the mouth both getting extra attention on more attractive faces. Now, what about the other side of the coin? Were there any facial areas that, when looked at more, were associated with lower attractiveness ratings?
Yes, there was a clear trend in the opposite direction. The study found what's called a negative correlation.
Meaning?
Simply put, it means that as the time spent looking at the forehead and the neck increased,
Uh-huh.
the attractiveness rating tended to go down.
So more looking at the forehead or neck equals less attractive.
Generally, yes. It suggests that when our attention is drawn to these areas, it might be because we're noticing something that, well, distracts from or detracts from the features we typically associate with attractiveness.
That makes intuitive sense, actually. If your eye keeps going to someone's forehead or neck, maybe you're noticing things that aren't contributing to that perception of attractiveness.
Exactly. Perhaps things perceived as flaws or
Sure.
just, distractions.
Now, let's dive into a really interesting aspect. Do men and women look at different things when they're deciding if someone is attractive? This study had some pretty specific findings on that, didn't it?
It did, and these were some of the most striking results, I'd say.
Okay, lay it on us.
When male participants were evaluating the attractiveness of female faces, the strongest predictor of a high attractiveness rating was the amount of time they spent looking at the mouth.
The mouth, just straight up, the mouth.
Pretty much. More time looking at the mouth correlated strongly with higher ratings from men.
Wow. Okay. What about when women were rating the attractiveness of male faces? Was their focus similar?
Not quite.
Yeah.
For female participants judging male attractiveness, their gaze patterns showed a different emphasis.
Different how?
They were more influenced in their ratings by the amount of time they spent looking at the eyes and the hair.
Eyes and hair for women looking at men, and the mouth for men looking at women.
That's the gist of it, yeah.
It's almost like we have different visual priorities depending on the gender dynamic, huh?
That's a very astute observation. And, if we think about potential evolutionary influences, these findings could align with some long-standing theories.
Like what?
Well, for example, the focus of men on the mouth of women has sometimes been linked to subconscious cues related to fertility and youth.
Okay.
Conversely, women's focus on men's eyes and hair might be tied to assessing traits like trustworthiness, maybe even status.
And what's so powerful about this study, you mentioned the eye tracking. It moves beyond just asking people what they think is attractive, right? Or showing them doctored images.
Exactly. This is hard data, tracking their actual eye movements in real time. It gives us a much more direct and sort of unfiltered look into these underlying preferences.
Yeah, less biased by what people say they look for.
Precisely.
So, taking these findings into the real world, the researchers touched on the implications for aesthetic medicine. How could understanding these gaze patterns be valuable in that field?
Well, think about it this way. People often pursue cosmetic procedures to enhance how they're perceived, right?
Sure.
Knowing precisely which facial areas naturally attract attention and how those areas impact overall attractiveness judgments could allow practitioners to tailor treatments much more effectively.
So it's about focusing efforts where they're likely to have the greatest visual impact.
Exactly. Instead of maybe a one-size-fits-all approach, they could target the features that genuinely capture attention based on this kind of data.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Now let's get a clearer picture of how this study was actually done. You mentioned eye tracking, but what were the key elements of their methodology?
Okay. So at the heart of it was the use of sophisticated eye tracking technology. This kit can precisely record where someone's gaze lands and, crucially, how long it stays on different parts of an image.
Right. And what were they looking at?
The participants were shown a collection of 40 high-quality photographs of diverse male and female faces.
And when you say diverse, what did that encompass in this study?
Good question. The images included people ranging in age from 20 to 60, representing a variety of racial and ethnic backgrounds.
Okay.
And importantly, all the faces displayed neutral expressions and had no visible makeup or any signs of cosmetic procedures.
So really standardized, natural faces.
Yeah, the goal was to study unaltered faces under controlled conditions.
And how did they get the participants to interact with these photos? What were the different tasks?
Right, there were 3 distinct groups of participants. One group was simply asked to rate the attractiveness of each face on a scale.
Okay, the judging group.
Yep. Another group was instructed to look for any indications of plastic surgery, a different kind of evaluation.
Interesting contrast.
And the third group, the free viewing group, just looked at the images without any specific task. Just look.
So that's the baseline, kind of?
Exactly.
Yeah.
It allowed the researchers to establish a baseline of just natural gaze patterns before layering on the judgment tasks. And each face was shown for a standard 10 seconds, and each person only saw each face once.
Okay, that controlled approach makes sense. Helps isolate the factors they were investigating. Now, as with any research, it's important to consider the limitations, right? What are some key things to keep in mind when we interpret these results?
Absolutely. Crucial point. It's really important to remember that the study used static two-dimensional photographs.
Just still pictures.
Right. Presented from a single frontal angle. Real-life interactions are way more dynamic. We see faces in motion with expressions from various perspectives.
Totally different ballgame than a static photo.
Definitely. Also, the researchers focused on broad facial areas, like the eyes or the mouth. They didn't analyze specific features within those areas, like, say, eye shape or lip fullness, which could also play a role.
Good point. The eyes could mean a lot of different things.
Exactly. And while the sample was diverse, which is great, individual cultural norms and just our own personal experiences inevitably shape our perceptions of beauty, too.
So the study gives valuable general insights, but individual preferences can still vary quite a bit. If that makes sense.
Yeah.
What did the researchers themselves suggest as potential avenues for future research in this area? Where do we go from here?
They proposed several interesting directions. One key suggestion was to use more dynamic stimuli.
Like videos.
Yeah, videos or even 3D models of faces. This could give a much richer understanding of how movement and different angles affect our gaze in a more realistic way.
That seems like a logical next step, for sure. Make it more lifelike.
Uh-huh. They also recommended delving deeper into those key facial areas they identified.
Like the eye shape thing you mentioned.
Exactly. Studying how specific aspects like lip fullness, maybe hair texture or eye symmetry influence where we look and how attractive we find someone.
Getting more granular.
Right. And finally, they suggested exploring the interplay of other factors. Things like someone's personality or even their voice interacting with these initial visual cues.
Wow, yeah. It really highlights how complex the whole perception of facial attractiveness is and how much more there is to learn.
Definitely.
So let's try and bring it all together for you, our listener. What are the core takeaways from this deep dive into this eye tracking study?
Okay, the big ones. The central facial triangle, eyes, nose, mouth, is super important. It's the primary focal point generally.
Right.
But when actively judging attractiveness, we seem to pay even closer attention to the mouth, nose, and cheeks.
Okay. And the link to ratings.
Faces rated as more attractive tend to hold our gaze longer on that central triangle, but also specifically on the hair in the mouth.
Hair and mouth again.
Yep. Whereas increased attention to the forehead and neck, that seem to correlate with lower attractiveness ratings.
Got it. And of course, the really striking gender-specific findings.
Can't forget those. Men's ratings of women's attractiveness were strongly linked to how long they looked at the mouth,
Key point.
while women's ratings of men were more influenced by their focus on the eyes and the hair.
Eyes and hair. Okay.
Exactly. So what might this mean for you? Well, it could prompt you to think differently about those initial moments when you meet someone,
Yeah.
about the visual information your brain is subconsciously processing, maybe without you even clocking it.
It might even offer a new perspective on why certain cosmetic changes are perceived as impactful, tying back to where our eyes naturally go.
Absolutely.
And here's a final thought to really consider. Given that our eyes are drawn to specific features almost instinctively based on this kind of research, how much of what we consciously consider attractive is truly a deliberate, rational decision?
That's a deep question.
And what other hidden biases might our gaze patterns reveal? Or maybe ponder this. Knowing these general trends and what captures our attention, how do individual tastes and unique preferences still create such a diverse and fascinating landscape of what we, personally, find beautiful?